December 1943. Berlin's night sky erupted with anti-aircraft fire as Luftwaffe controllers screamed coordinates into their radios, desperately trying to intercept phantom raiders that shouldn't exist. American intelligence officers in London studied intercepts of German radio chatter with mounting fascination. Enemy fighter pilots reported engaging British aircraft traveling at impossible speeds, over 400 miles per hour, armed with only 4 cannons, made almost entirely of wood. Hermann Göring himself had dismissed early reports as British propaganda and defeatist lies. But the planes were real, their tactics were revolutionary, and their impact on the air war would force Germany's most arrogant military commanders to confront a terrifying truth. American operational doctrine and British engineering ingenuity had combined to create something that shattered every assumption about aerial warfare. The wooden miracle shouldn't have worked, but it did. And by the time German Fighter Command understood what they were facing, it was already too late. March 17, 1943. 8:47 hours. 8th Air Force Headquarters, High Wycombe, England. The temperature hovered at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Rain pounded the windows, and the air inside the operations room smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and exhaustion that had settled into the walls like mildew. Major Robert Henderson, 29, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, stood before a wall map of occupied Europe covered in red pins marking bomber losses. Each pin represented 10 American boys who would never see Kansas wheat fields or Brooklyn streets again. The numbers told a story that no amount of optimism could soften. In the past 8 weeks, the 8th Air Force had lost 147 heavy bombers over German-occupied territory. That meant 1,470 trained aircrew, dead, captured, or missing. The strategic situation was brutally simple and increasingly untenable. American doctrine called for daylight precision bombing, B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flying in tight formations at 25,000 feet, protected by their own defensive guns, striking factories and rail yards with Norden bomb sites. The theory was sound. The reality was a slaughter. German FW-190s and Bf-109s ripped through bomber formations with methodical efficiency. Black batteries turned the sky black with explosive shells. American fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, couldn't escort the bombers deep into Germany because they lacked the range. Beyond the Dutch coast, American bombers flew alone into defended airspace where Luftwaffe fighters waited in force. The statistics were apocalyptic and getting worse. Loss rates exceeded 8% per mission. Basic mathematics demonstrated the inevitable conclusion. At that attrition rate, every bomber crew would be shot down before completing their required 25-mission tour. Young men from Nebraska farms and Pennsylvania steel towns climbed into B-17s, knowing their odds of survival were worse than infantry in Normandy. Morale was fracturing. Replacement crews arrived at bases in East Anglia, only to watch their barracks emptied within weeks. The smell of burned flesh lingered in damaged aircraft. Ground crews wept openly when planes didn't return. Major Henderson had been a mechanical engineering professor at Iowa State University before Pearl Harbor. He understood stress calculations, material properties, and systems analysis. He also understood that the current operational approach was mathematically unsustainable. The numbers didn't lie. America was losing the air war despite industrial superiority because German fighters had tactical freedom to concentrate overwhelming force against unescorted bombers. Every briefing brought the same reports. Fighters swarming bomber formations, concentrated cannon fire, aircraft spiraling down trailing smoke, parachutes blossoming if crews had time to bail out before the plane exploded. The strategic dilemma was existential. America's entire European strategy depended on destroying German industrial capacity through strategic bombing before the planned invasion of France. Without air superiority, D-Day would fail. Without long-range escort fighters, bombers couldn't survive deep penetration raids. Without destroying German fighter production, the Luftwaffe would only grow stronger. The war effort faced a tactical puzzle that conventional solutions couldn't solve. How do you protect bombers 600 miles from base when your fighters can't fly that far? Henderson had spent 3 months analyzing British operations for patterns that American planners might have missed. The British had abandoned daylight bombing in 1940 after catastrophic losses forced them into night operations. But British intelligence reports referenced something unusual, a new aircraft designated Mosquito that violated every principle of combat aircraft design, yet achieved results that seemed impossible. It was made primarily of wood, plywood and balsa, materials that American engineers dismissed as structurally inadequate for combat speeds. It carried only 4 cannons and no defensive armament. It had a crew of just 2. Yet British reports claimed it flew faster than any German fighter, operated at altitudes exceeding 40,000 feet, and completed missions with loss rates below 1%. American senior officers were skeptical to the point of hostility. Brigadier General Howard Stark, 52, from Boston, Massachusetts, represented the established Air Force hierarchy. He had flown bombers in World War I, believed in massed formations, concentrated firepower, and armor protection. The idea of a wooden aircraft with minimal armament contradicted everything the Army Air Forces had invested billions developing. Wood, Stark had said during a staff meeting, his Boston accent sharp with contempt. The British are building combat aircraft out of goddamn furniture materials. That's desperation, not innovation. We don't need circus tricks. We need more P-47s, more B-17s, and more discipline in our formations. But Henderson saw something that rigid doctrine missed. The Mosquito's success wasn't despite its unconventional design. It was because of it. By eliminating defensive armament, armor plating and heavy bomb loads, British designers had created an aircraft so fast that German fighters couldn't catch it. Speed became defense. Wooden construction meant production didn't compete with aluminum supplies desperately needed for heavy bombers. The aircraft could be built in furniture factories by workers who had never touched aviation projects. It was pragmatic innovation born from desperation, exactly the kind of solution that America's industrial flexibility could amplify if military leadership would accept that conventional wisdom had failed. The turning point came on March 15, 1943, when the 8th Air Force lost 26 bombers over Bremen in a single day. That evening, Henderson sat in the officers' club at High Wycombe, drinking bad scotch and reading casualty lists. Flight Lieutenant Anthony Morrison, RAF, sat down uninvited. Morrison was 27 from London, a Mosquito pilot with 43 combat missions. He had the bearing of someone who had seen too much death but refused to become numb to it. Your boys are dying because you're fighting last war's battle with last war's tactics, Morrison said quietly. The Mosquito works because we stopped trying to out-armor the enemy and started out-thinking them. Henderson spent the next week at RAF Marham, observing Mosquito operations. What he witnessed contradicted everything his training had taught him. Mosquitoes launched at dusk, flew individually or in pairs, climbed to 35,000 feet, crossed into German airspace at speeds exceeding 380 Mosquitoes, struck targets with precision bombing using low-altitude marking techniques, and returned before German fighters could organize intercepts. They flew nuisance raids over Berlin purely to disrupt sleep and force Luftwaffe fighters to scramble, wasting fuel and pilot rest hours. They conducted photo reconnaissance missions over heavily defended targets that American heavy bombers would have required fighter escort to reach. The operational data was irrefutable. In 6 months of operations, RAF Mosquito squadrons had flown 1,847 sorties and lost 23 aircraft, a loss rate of 1.2%. Comparable American bomber missions suffered losses between 5% and 12%. A single Mosquito cost $20,000 to build and required 8,000 man-hours. A B-17 cost $240,000 and required 55,000 man-hours. The Mosquito carried a smaller bomb load, but delivered it with greater accuracy because it flew below flak ceiling during attack runs. It required a crew of 2 versus 10 for a heavy bomber. The mathematics were compelling. For the cost of one B-17 and its crew, America could field 12 Mosquitoes, completing missions German defenses couldn't counter. Henderson drafted a proposal that landed on desks in Washington like a hand grenade. He recommended immediate procurement of 500 Mosquitoes through Lend-Lease, training of American crews at RAF facilities, integration into 8th Air Force operations for pathfinding and tactical reconnaissance, and, most controversially, adaptation of Mosquito operational doctrine into American strategic bombing planning. The proposal argued that American daylight precision bombing doctrine was correct in theory, but unsustainable in practice without tactical flexibility that only high-speed, lightly armed aircraft could provide. The proposal triggered bureaucratic warfare that made combat operations look civilized. General Stark called Henderson into his office and unleashed a tirade about defeatist thinking, British propaganda, and abandoning American boys in favor of wooden toys. Senior procurement officers argued that wooden aircraft had no place in modern warfare. Fighter Command opposed diverting resources from P-47 production. Strategic bombing advocates insisted that massed formations of heavy bombers represented the only path to victory. The institutional resistance was monolithic and hostile, but Henderson had allies in unexpected places. Lieutenant General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, recognized that current attrition rates would destroy his command before 1944. He approved a limited trial, 2 Mosquito squadrons attached to the 8th Air Force for pathfinding operations. American crews would train at RAF Marham, fly British aircraft under American operational command, and prove whether speed and innovation could accomplish what armor and firepower had failed to achieve. The order arrived on April 3, 1943, with a handwritten note from Eaker. Henderson, you get 6 months to prove your theory. If you're wrong, those boys' deaths are on your conscience. If you're right, you might just save this whole goddamn war effort. The journey was beginning not because the military establishment believed in it, but because the alternative, continuing to send bomber crews to their deaths at mathematically unsustainable rates, had become morally and operationally indefensible. Henderson understood the weight of that responsibility as he boarded a transport to RAF Marham. Somewhere over the English Channel, watching the grey water below, he thought about the young men from Iowa and Nebraska and Pennsylvania who would fly missions in wooden aircraft against an enemy that didn't believe they existed. He thought about the German fighter controllers who would scramble their pilots against targets they couldn't catch. And he thought about the fundamental truth that the Mosquito represented. Innovation beats tradition when survival demands it. April 12, 1943. 06:15 hours. RAF Marham, Norfolk, England. The morning temperature was 41 degrees. Fog rolled across the airfield thick enough to taste. And Captain James Jimmy Keller, 24, from Detroit, Michigan, stood beside a de Havilland Mosquito, wondering if the British had lost their minds. The aircraft looked like something a furniture factory had produced as a joke. The fuselage was plywood, actual wood veneer, smooth to the touch and smelling faintly of glue. The wings flexed visibly when mechanics pushed on them. The cockpit was cramped, barely enough room for pilot and navigator sitting side by side. There was no armor plating behind the seats, no defensive guns, no turrets, nothing that resembled the B-17s Keller had flown in training. 4 20mm cannons protruded from the nose, but those were offensive weapons. If a German fighter got on your tail, your only defense was to be faster. "This thing looks like my kid brother's model airplane," Keller said to his navigator, Lieutenant Daniel Chen, 23, from San Francisco. Chen, whose parents had been sent to Manzanar internment camp 2 months earlier, ran his hand over the wooden fuselage and replied quietly, "My father built furniture in Chinatown. He always said wood is stronger than people think, if you know how to work with it." The training program was designed by RAF instructors who had learned through trial and error what American airmen would now absorb through accelerated indoctrination. 12 American crews, 24 men, had been selected from bomber and fighter squadrons. All were experienced aviators. None were prepared for what flying a Mosquito demanded. Flight Lieutenant Morrison, now their primary instructor, gathered them in a briefing room that smelled of damp concrete and aviation fuel. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "The Mosquito is the fastest operational aircraft in the European theatre," he began, his London accent cutting through the morning fog outside. "It will outrun any German fighter in level flight, but speed is only useful if you don't make mistakes. And in a Mosquito, mistakes kill you instantly because there's nothing between you and a cannon shell except 3 8-inch plywood and the hope that you're too fast to hit." The first 2 weeks were ground school covering aerodynamics that violated everything American pilots had learned. The Mosquito's wooden construction meant it handled differently than aluminum aircraft. Wood absorbed moisture, affecting weight distribution. The aircraft was tail-heavy at low speeds, requiring constant trim adjustments. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, same power plants used in P-51 Mustangs, generated 1,680 horsepower each, pushing the 16,000-pound airframe to speeds exceeding 400 mm/s. At those velocities, control inputs had to be gentle because aggressive maneuvers could cause structural failure. American pilots trained on rugged aircraft that could handle rough handling. The Mosquito demanded precision and respect. The physical environment of wartime Britain added layers of complexity that stateside training had never addressed. RAF Marham operated under constant threat of German intruder raids. Luftwaffe Me 4-10s and Ju 88s specifically targeted British bomber bases, strafing parked aircraft and dropping fragmentation bombs on hangars. Crews slept in Nissen huts, corrugated steel shelters, heated by coal stoves that barely kept the interior above freezing. Food was rationed. Powdered eggs, bread with margarine, weak tea, fresh vegetables were rare luxuries. Coffee was practically non-existent, replaced by bitter British tea that American stomachs rejected initially. The psychological adjustment was as brutal as the physical. This wasn't stateside training where instructors emphasized safety. This was operational conversion in an active combat zone, where German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the base regularly, and students knew that in weeks they'd be flying these wooden aircraft into defended German airspace at night. Captain Keller's first flight nearly ended in disaster. Morrison sat in the right seat as Keller advanced the throttles. The acceleration was shocking. 2,100 horsepower pulling 16,000 pounds felt like being shot from a catapult. The Mosquito lifted off at 120 mph after a takeoff roll that seemed impossibly short. Then Keller tried to climb at the angle he'd used in B-17s. The aircraft's nose came up too steeply, airspeed dropped, and the left wing dipped sharply as the aircraft approached a stall at 800 feet altitude. Morrison grabbed the controls without a word, pushed the nose down, added power, and brought them back to level flight. His voice was calm but cold. "This isn't a bloody bomber, it's a racehorse. Treat it like one, or it'll kill you before the Germans get the chance." The learning curve was brutal and unforgiving. Lieutenant Patrick Sullivan, 22, from Boston, tried a high-speed turn at low altitude during his third training flight. The structural stress exceeded limits, causing a wing spar to crack. He managed to land, but the Mosquito was grounded for repairs. Morrison assembled the American crews and made them inspect the damage. A 3-inch crack in the main spar where excessive G-forces had overstressed the wooden structure. "Wood doesn't bend like aluminum," Morrison explained, his finger tracing the crack. "It breaks, and when it breaks at 350 miles per hour at 500 feet altitude, you don't get to bail out. You just die." Remember that next time you think this aircraft is forgiving. The technical challenges were compounded by operational realities that American doctrine had not prepared them for. Mosquito missions were flown individually or in pairs, not formations. Navigation was entirely the responsibility of the two-man crew. No lead navigator, no formation discipline, no relying on others. British navigation used the G system, a radio navigation network covering northwest Europe, but it was subject to German jamming. Dead reckoning required constant mental calculation, accounting for wind drift, magnetic variation, and fuel consumption. Lieutenant Chen spent 16-hour days studying navigation techniques, learning to calculate positions while wearing oxygen masks in darkness, while the aircraft maneuvered violently to avoid flak. The cognitive load was immense. Maintain aircraft systems, navigate to target, identify landmarks through clouds and darkness, coordinate with pilot, monitor fuel state, watch for enemy fighters, all while flying at speeds that gave seconds to react to threats. The first operational mission assigned to American crews was a reconnaissance flight over occupied France. The target was a rail yard at Amiens, lightly defended but operationally significant. Keller and Chen launched at 21:45 hours on May 8, 1943. The night was moonless, visibility poor, cloud cover at 8,000 feet. They climbed to 25,000 feet, crossed the English Channel, entered French airspace flying at 360 mph. Chen navigated using G coordinates cross-referenced with dead reckoning. German radar detected them. Radio intercepts confirmed Luftwaffe controllers scrambling night fighters. But by the time Bf-110s reached the intercept coordinates, the Mosquito was 40 miles away, photographing the rail yard from 15,000 feet, then climbing back to altitude and racing for the coast at maximum continuous power. They landed at Marham at 047 hours. Keller's hands shook as he shut down the engines. Chen sat motionless for 3 minutes, processing the fact that they had penetrated German-defended airspace, completed their mission, and returned without ever seeing an enemy aircraft. Morrison met them on the hard stand. "Now you understand," he said simply. "Speed is survival. The Germans can't shoot what they can't catch." But not everyone adapted successfully. Lieutenant Thomas Bradford, 25, from Atlanta, Georgia, froze during his first operational mission over Belgium. German flak burst around his Mosquito at 18,000 feet, the concussions rattling the wooden airframe, and he instinctively dove for the deck, standard bomber pilot response to evade flak. But at low altitude in darkness over unfamiliar terrain, spatial disorientation set in. He nearly flew into the ground before his navigator screamed a warning. They aborted the mission, returned to base, and Bradford was removed from operational flying. Morrison was blunt in the debriefing. "This aircraft demands you trust your training and your instruments absolutely. If you panic, you die. There's no margin for error." The psychological toll was as severe as the physical demands. American crews lived with constant awareness that they flew aircraft their own military establishment considered inadequate, using tactics that violated American doctrine in an environment where German defenses were optimized to destroy exactly what they were doing. Letters home couldn't mention operations, aircraft types, or locations. Families in Detroit and San Francisco and Boston had no idea their sons were flying wooden aircraft over Germany at night. The isolation was profound. British crews accepted Americans as colleagues, but maintained professional distance shaped by years of combat losses. American bomber crews at other 8th Air Force bases viewed Mosquito pilots as oddities who had abandoned real flying for British gimmicks. The operational tempo accelerated through May and June 1943. American Mosquito crews flew reconnaissance missions, photographing German fighter bases, pathfinding operations marking targets for heavy bomber raids, and nuisance attacks disrupting Luftwaffe night operations. They learned through experience what no training could teach: how to read German flak patterns, when to climb and when to descend, how to use clouds for concealment, how to interpret radio chatter indicating fighter intercepts. The loss rate remained extraordinarily low. One American Mosquito lost in 2 months. Crew captured after mechanical failure forced emergency landing in occupied Netherlands. By July 1943, the 12 original American crews had flown 184 combat missions and suffered 1 operational loss. Comparable American bomber operations during the same period showed loss rates 6 times higher. The statistical validation was irrefutable, but institutional resistance persisted. General Stark visited Marham in late July and watched Keller brief a reconnaissance mission over the Ruhr industrial region. After the briefing, Stark pulled Henderson aside. "Your boys are doing good work," Stark admitted grudgingly, "but this doesn't change fundamental doctrine. We're not abandoning strategic bombing in favor of wooden speedsters. This is a niche capability, nothing more." Henderson didn't argue. He had learned that results spoke louder than doctrine. The Mosquito was proving itself in combat. Eventually, even the most rigid military hierarchy would have to acknowledge reality. The chapter of brutal operational conversion was ending with validation earned through survival. American crews had learned to fly an aircraft their own military had dismissed, adopted tactics that contradicted established doctrine, and achieved results that conventional approaches had failed to produce. The psychological transformation was as significant as the tactical adaptation. They were no longer conventional bomber pilots. They were something new, high-speed pathfinders who embraced innovation because the alternative, continuing failed strategies, was morally indefensible. As summer 1943 faded into autumn, the question was no longer whether the Mosquito worked. The question was whether German Fighter Command could develop countermeasures before this wooden miracle shifted the air war's strategic balance irreversibly. August 19, 1943. 2:47 hours. Luftwaffe Fighter Command Headquarters, Berlin Tempelhof. Oberst Colonel Klaus Reinhardt, 41, studied a map of northwestern Europe with growing frustration that had evolved into something approaching professional humiliation. The map was covered in reports from night fighter controllers: intercepts attempted but failed, radar contacts lost, bomber formations that turned out to be single aircraft moving at speeds that violated every operational estimate. The pattern had been building for months, dismissed initially as radar malfunction or pilot error. But the data was undeniable now, and it told a story that contradicted everything German air defense doctrine presumed about British capabilities. Reinhardt came from Prussian military aristocracy, had flown reconnaissance missions in World War I, and had spent 20 years studying aerial combat theory. He believed in systematic analysis, operational discipline, and the superiority of German engineering. The Luftwaffe's night fighter force was the most sophisticated air defense system in the world, radar-equipped Bf-110s and Ju-88s, guided by ground controllers, supported by searchlight batteries and coordinated flak zones. The system had inflicted catastrophic losses on British bomber formations in 1940 and 1941, forcing the RAF into dispersed tactics and electronic countermeasures. German doctrine held that any aircraft penetrating German airspace would be detected, intercepted, and destroyed through coordinated response. The system was mathematically sound. It should work. But something was slipping through that net with regularity that suggested systematic failure rather than isolated incidents. Intelligence reports compiled over June and July 1943 documented 67 separate instances of unidentified aircraft penetrating German airspace, completing missions over defended targets, and escaping before night fighters could execute successful intercepts. The aircraft appeared on radar as single contacts, not bomber formations. They flew at altitudes between 25,000 and 35,000 feet, well above normal bomber operations. Their speed was reported as 350-380 mph, faster than any known British bomber by margins that suggested either radar miscalibration or aircraft types that German intelligence had not identified. The breakthrough came from a Bf-110 night fighter pilot, Hauptmann Captain Werner Hoffmann, who achieved a visual intercept over the Ruhr Valley on August 12th. Hoffmann's after-action report read like science fiction. Radar contact at 28,000 feet, heading east at high speed. Ground control vectored intercept, but contact was pulling away despite full throttle. Achieved visual identification briefly. Twin-engine aircraft, British markings, streamlined silhouette unlike Lancaster or Halifax. No gun turrets visible. Contact accelerated to estimated 400 meters and disappeared into cloud cover. Attempted pursuit, but could not maintain contact. Aircraft maneuverability suggested fighter performance in bomber-sized airframe. Reinhardt brought the report to Major General Josef Kammhuber, architect of Germany's night fighter defense system. Kammhuber read it with visible skepticism. 400 miles per hour? He said, his Bavarian accent thick with disbelief. That's fighter speed. No bomber can achieve that velocity with operationally useful payload. Your pilots saw a British fighter on ferry flight and misidentified it as a bomber. But Reinhardt had cross-referenced the report with signals intelligence. British radio traffic that night included coordination for a photo reconnaissance mission over Essen, precisely where Hoffmann's intercept occurred. Whatever Hoffmann had seen, it had completed an operational mission, not a ferry flight. The arrogance of German air defense doctrine was rooted in assumptions that British industrial capacity could not challenge German technological superiority. German engineers had spent years developing radar-guided night fighters, coordinated defense networks, and sophisticated early warning systems. British responses had been electronic countermeasures, jamming, chaff, deception, tactics that acknowledged German technical advantage. The idea that Britain had developed an aircraft that simply outran German defenses contradicted the fundamental premise of Luftwaffe strategic thinking, that German engineering superiority would always provide tactical advantage. German intelligence agencies began analyzing the evidence with methodical precision. Signals intelligence intercepted British radio traffic referencing Mossy operations, assumed to be code for a specific mission type. Photo reconnaissance identified aircraft at RAF bases with twin-engine configuration, slender fuselage, and no visible defensive armament. Interrogation of downed British aircrew produced fragments of information. Wooden construction, Rolls-Royce engines, speed exceeding 380 mph, operational altitude above 30,000 feet. Individually, each data point seemed anomalous. Collectively, they described an aircraft that violated German assumptions about combat aircraft design. The operational impact was measurable and increasingly problematic. German night fighter pilots reported declining morale as intercept attempts consistently failed. Controllers scrambled fighters based on radar contacts, but by the time fighters reached intercept coordinates, the target had moved 40-50 miles away. Fuel consumption increased as fighters pursued contacts they couldn't catch. Pilot fatigue worsened as unsuccessful scrambles disrupted rest cycles. The psychological effect was corrosive. German airmen trained in the world's most advanced air defense system were being outmaneuvered by an enemy aircraft they rarely even saw. The strategic implications were more severe. The aircraft, now identified definitively as the de Havilland Mosquito, was conducting pathfinding operations, marking targets for British heavy bomber formations. American daylight bombing was already stretching German fighter resources to breaking point. Now British night operations were being guided by aircraft German defenses couldn't intercept. The Mosquito force was also conducting nuisance raids over German cities, dropping small bomb loads but forcing air defense networks to activate, wasting fuel, disrupting industrial production, and eroding civilian morale through unpredictable attacks that sirens couldn't provide warning against because the aircraft was too fast. Oberst Reinhardt proposed countermeasures grounded in German operational doctrine. First, develop faster night fighters. The Me-410 and later variants could potentially match Mosquito performance, though development timelines extended into 1944. Second, concentrate flak batteries along known approach routes, creating saturation fire zones too dense to penetrate. Third, deploy radar-guided anti-aircraft artillery that could track high-speed targets. Fourth, improve early warning networks to provide longer intercept windows. Each countermeasure required resources, industrial capacity, trained personnel, time that Germany increasingly lacked as Allied bombing degraded production capacity. But the fundamental problem wasn't technical. It was doctrinal. German air defense philosophy assumed that defense was about interception. Detect the threat. Vector fighters destroy the enemy. The Mosquito invalidated that assumption by making interception impossible through sheer speed. British operational doctrine had evolved. If you can't survive through armor and firepower, survive through speed and altitude. German doctrine hadn't adapted because admitting that a wooden aircraft built by furniture factories represented superior operational thinking would undermine the ideological foundation of German military superiority. The moment of comprehension came during a staff meeting on September 3, 1943. Reinhardt presented 6 months of operational data, 247 confirmed Mosquito incursions, 18 successful intercept attempts, 0 confirmed kills. Loss rates for Mosquito operations were estimated below 2%, compared to 5 to 8% for British heavy bombers. The aircraft was completing reconnaissance, pathfinding, and tactical bombing missions with impunity. Kamhuber stared at the data and said quietly, "We built the world's most sophisticated air defense system, and the British defeated it by building an aircraft so simple and so fast that all our sophistication became irrelevant." The psychological impact on German fighter controllers was documented in signals intelligence intercepts. Controllers expressed frustration that bordered on disbelief, contact moving too fast for intercept, radar track lost, target speed exceeds fighter capability, scramble cancelled, target already beyond range. The language reflected cognitive dissonance. The system should work. Doctrine said it should work. Yet empirical reality demonstrated repeated failure. American intelligence analysts monitoring these intercepts recognized the strategic significance immediately. When your enemy's operational commanders stop trusting their own systems, morale collapse follows. German propaganda attempted to minimize the Mosquito's impact, referring to operations as terror raids and nuisance attacks that had no strategic significance. But industrial production statistics told a different story. Mosquito raids on precision targets, ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, V-weapon sites caused disruptions disproportionate to bomb tonnage delivered because accuracy compensated for payload limitations. A single Mosquito striking a transformer station could shut down production for days. Repair crews couldn't predict where next attack would come because the aircraft approached too fast for effective early warning. By October 1943, German Fighter Command had effectively conceded that conventional intercept tactics could not counter Mosquito operations. Resources were redirected toward defending against American daylight bombing and British heavy night raids. Threats that could be engaged using established doctrine, the Mosquito was categorized as an operational nuisance that caused damage disproportionate to its numbers but didn't represent an existential threat. That assessment was fundamentally incorrect, but German strategic thinking couldn't acknowledge that a wooden aircraft represented doctrinal revolution rather than tactical anomaly. The perplexity of German commanders reflected broader failure to adapt when innovation contradicts doctrine. The Mosquito succeeded not because German air defenses were poorly designed, but because British operational thinking had evolved beyond paradigm that German defenses were optimized to counter. American crews flying Mosquitoes understood this intuitively. They weren't defeating German fighters through superior firepower or better armor. They were defeating German fighters by refusing to fight on terms where German advantages mattered. Speed, altitude, and precision replaced armor, firepower, and formation discipline. The paradigm shift was complete, and German fighter command's inability to adapt ensured that the wooden phantom would continue haunting their operations through war's end. May 8, 1945, 16:15 hours. RAF Marham, Norfolk, England. Victory in Europe Day. The temperature was 64 degrees, unseasonably warm, and the airfield that had trained American Mosquito crews 2 years earlier was now silent, except for celebration sounds drifting from the officers' club. Captain James Keller, now Major Keller, 26, stood beside a de Havilland Mosquito FB-6, running his hand over the wooden fuselage one last time. The aircraft had completed 187 combat missions: reconnaissance over Germany, pathfinding for bomber streams, precision strikes on tactical targets, photo reconnaissance of V-weapon sites. It had never been hit by enemy fire, not once. In 32 months of operations, American Mosquito crews attached to the 8th Air Force had flown 4,091 combat sorties and lost 23 aircraft, a loss rate of 0.47%. Comparable B-17 operations during the same period showed loss rates averaging 4.5%. The mathematics were irrefutable. Speed had proven superior to armor. The strategic impact of the Mosquito program extended far beyond loss statistics. American crews had provided pathfinding that dramatically improved bombing accuracy during critical operations. The raids on Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants, Ploesti oil refineries, and German synthetic fuel facilities relied on Mosquito reconnaissance to identify targets and assess damage. The D-Day invasion depended on Mosquito photo reconnaissance that mapped German coastal defenses with precision no heavy bomber could achieve. The aircraft's high-altitude capability enabled photographic intelligence that revealed German V-weapon sites, allowing targeted destruction before rocket attacks could devastate London. The Mosquito hadn't replaced strategic bombing. It had made strategic bombing operationally feasible by providing capabilities that heavy bombers couldn't deliver. The human cost of the program was measured in lives saved as much as missions completed. Major Henderson, now Lieutenant Colonel Henderson 32, had calculated the numbers with mathematical precision. If American bomber operations from 1943-1945 had continued at loss rates experienced before Mosquito pathfinding and tactical reconnaissance improved operational effectiveness, estimated additional casualties would have exceeded 18,000 aircrew. Those young men from Iowa and Nebraska and Pennsylvania had returned home because innovation provided alternatives to sending them into defended airspace without capabilities to counter German defenses effectively. The wooden aircraft that senior officers had dismissed as British circus tricks had proven that sometimes the most effective solution contradicts institutional assumptions. The personal stories of American Mosquito crews reflected broader transformation in how military organizations approach innovation. Lieutenant Daniel Chen, whose parents had been imprisoned in internment camps while he flew combat missions for the nation that imprisoned them, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for 67 combat missions. When asked about the contradiction, Chen replied quietly, "My father built furniture from wood. He taught me that strength isn't always about being hardest or heaviest. Sometimes strength is about being flexible enough to bend without breaking. That's what the Mosquito taught us. Flexibility defeats rigidity." Chen would return to San Francisco, complete a doctorate in aerospace engineering at Stanford, and spend 40 years teaching aircraft design principles that emphasized operational adaptability over doctrinal purity. Major Keller returned to Detroit and rejoined the automotive industry, bringing lessons learned from wooden aircraft to industrial production. In 1947, he published a paper titled Adaptive Manufacturing: Lessons from Wartime Aviation Innovation, that analyzed how British furniture factories had produced combat aircraft using non-traditional materials and decentralized production. The paper influenced post-war American manufacturing philosophy, emphasizing that innovation often comes from resource constraints, forcing creative solutions. Keller's argument was simple. If wood furniture factories could build aircraft that defeated the world's most sophisticated air defense system, then American industrial capacity could solve any problem if freed from doctrinal rigidity. The institutional resistance that had nearly killed the program became case study in how military bureaucracies struggle with innovation. Brigadier General Stark, who had opposed Mosquito procurement, retired in 1946 without ever publicly acknowledging that his opposition had been wrong. But internal Army Air Forces documents declassified in 1975 revealed the depth of conflict. Stark had written to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall in July 1943, arguing that diverting resources to British wooden aircraft represents defeatist mentality incompatible with American operational doctrine. Marshall's response was brief and devastating. Doctrine that kills our boys at unsustainable rates is doctrine that needs changing. Results matter, theories don't. The Mosquitoes' operational record became reference point for post-war military education. The Air Force Academy curriculum included case studies on how the aircraft's unconventional design enabled operational capabilities that conventional approaches couldn't achieve. The lessons emphasized: first, resource constraints can drive innovation more effectively than unlimited budgets because scarcity forces creative problem-solving. Second, operational effectiveness matters more than adherence to doctrine. Doctrine should serve operations, not constrain them. Third, sometimes the most important innovations come from accepting that conventional wisdom is wrong and having courage to pursue alternatives despite institutional resistance. The technological legacy was equally significant. The Mosquito demonstrated that speed and altitude could provide defense superior to armor and defensive armament, influencing post-war development of high-speed reconnaissance aircraft like the U-2 and SR-71 Blackbird. The concept of using lightweight materials to achieve performance advantages shaped development of composite materials in modern aviation. The aircraft's pathfinding role pioneered precision navigation techniques that evolved into GPS-guided munitions and satellite reconnaissance. The Mosquito wasn't just successful aircraft, it was proof of concept for operational philosophy that prioritized flexibility, speed, and precision over mass and armor. The German perspective, documented through post-war interrogations, revealed the psychological impact of facing enemy capability that doctrine hadn't prepared them to counter. Oberst Reinhardt, captured by American forces in April 1945, provided extensive debriefing on Luftwaffe night fighter operations. When asked about the Mosquito's impact, he said, "We built our air defense system on assumption that we could intercept any threat given sufficient radar coverage and fighter resources. The Mosquito invalidated that assumption by being too fast to intercept reliably. We could detect it, but detection without successful interception is just frustration." Eventually, our controllers stopped scrambling fighters against Mosquito contacts because fuel expenditure exceeded likelihood of success. That's when we knew we had lost the tactical initiative. The strategic transformation was most visible in how subsequent conflicts approached air operations. The Vietnam War saw extensive use of high-speed tactical reconnaissance aircraft and precision-guided munitions, direct descendants of Mosquito operational doctrine. The Gulf War's emphasis on precision strikes, delivered by fast, low-observable aircraft, reflected lessons learned from wooden aircraft flying over Germany 50 years earlier, survive through speed and accuracy rather than armor and mass. Modern drone warfare, with emphasis on persistent reconnaissance and precision targeting, represents evolution of capabilities that the Mosquito pioneered in 1943. The human dimension of the legacy was measured in reunions held every 5 years at RAF Marham, where aging veterans, British and American, gathered to remember fallen comrades and celebrate survival. At the 1985 reunion, Major Keller, now 66 and retired from Ford Motor Company, gave a speech that captured the essence of what the Mosquito had represented. "We flew wooden aircraft that our own military didn't believe in, using tactics that contradicted established doctrine, against an enemy that couldn't accept that we existed until it was too late. We survived because we were willing to trust innovation over tradition, speed over armor, and mission success over institutional pride." That's not just a war story. That's a lesson about how organizations survive when circumstances demand change. Lieutenant Colonel Henderson, who had championed the program despite career-threatening opposition, retired as a Major General in 1965. His farewell address to Air Force Academy cadets included reflection on the Mosquito program. Military organizations are inherently conservative because lives depend on proven methods. But conservatism becomes fatal when circumstances change and doctrine doesn't adapt. The Mosquito succeeded because a handful of people recognized that losing 8% of bomber crews per mission was unsustainable, and they had courage to pursue solutions that contradicted everything their training had taught them. That courage, willingness to challenge doctrine when empirical evidence demands it, is more important than any specific tactic or technology. The physical legacy was preserved at museums across America and Britain. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. displayed a Mosquito FB-SEC with notation explaining its historical significance. This aircraft represents one of World War II's most successful innovations, a wooden bomber faster than contemporary fighters, built by furniture factories that achieved loss rates below 1% while completing missions deep into German-defended territory. It demonstrated that operational effectiveness comes from matching capabilities to mission requirements, not from following doctrinal assumptions. Thousands of visitors annually walked past the wooden aircraft, most unaware of the bureaucratic battles and institutional resistance that had nearly prevented its operational deployment. The final assessment came from unexpected source. In 1978, Soviet aviation historian Dmitry Volkogonov published analysis of Allied air operations that included extensive examination of Mosquito effectiveness. Volkogonov's conclusion startled Western military analysts. The de Havilland Mosquito represented more significant innovation than American B-29 Superfortress or British Lancaster heavy bomber because it demonstrated that tactical paradigms could be invalidated through unconventional design philosophy. Soviet air defense doctrine spent decades preparing to counter American heavy bombers, only to discover that precision-guided munitions delivered by high-speed platforms rendered mass bombing obsolete. The Mosquito proved that lesson in 1943, but military establishments worldwide required another 30 years to internalize it. As the 20th century ended, the Mosquito's legacy lived on in debates about military procurement, innovation management, and institutional adaptation to change. Business schools taught case studies on how British furniture factories pivoted to aircraft production, demonstrating organizational flexibility. Engineering programs analyzed the aircraft's wooden construction as example of material science innovation driven by resource constraints. Leadership courses examined the bureaucratic resistance Henderson faced, using it to illustrate challenges of championing innovation against institutional inertia. The story of German fighter command's inability to believe that Mosquitoes, with only 4 guns, could be operationally significant, followed by their complete inability to counter them, became cautionary tale about arrogance of doctrinal rigidity. Military historians used it to illustrate how organizations fail when they refuse to adapt to empirical evidence that contradicts foundational assumptions. The Mosquito didn't just defeat German air defenses. It proved that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with most firepower, but the one willing to abandon conventional wisdom in pursuit of mission success. On November 15, 2003, the last surviving Mosquito pilot from the original American training program, Daniel Chen, now 83, gave his final public interview before passing away 3 months later. Asked what the Mosquito had meant to his generation, Chen replied, "We were young men, asked to do something that everyone said was impossible, fly wooden aircraft into the most heavily defended airspace in history and survive. We did it because we trusted innovation more than doctrine, because we believed that intelligence and speed could defeat firepower and armor, and because we refused to accept that the cost of war had to be measured in acceptable loss rates." The Mosquito proved that there's always another way if you're brave enough to look for it. That's a lesson every generation needs to relearn. The story of the Mosquito reminds us that courage isn't just about facing the enemy. It's about challenging assumptions, embracing innovation, and refusing to accept that failure is inevitable. These wooden warriors proved that speed, intelligence, and determination can overcome any obstacle. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and join our community of history enthusiasts who believe that the past has powerful lessons for the present. Drop a comment below telling us which moment from this story resonated most with you. Was it the crews training in wooden aircraft, the German controllers' frustration, or the lasting legacy of innovation over tradition? And don't forget to smash that like button to help this story reach more people who appreciate the incredible ingenuity and bravery of the greatest generation. We have more untold stories from World War II coming your way, revealing the hidden heroes and forgotten innovations that changed history. See you in the next one. Stay curious, stay inspired, and remember, sometimes the impossible is just innovation waiting to happen.